Joe, put that bag back on!
So I already made a community post about this like 2 months ago, but I think about it so often that I'm turning it into a video. So, I'm kidding. I'm not actually gonna wear the wig the whole time. I've already made a community post about this like 2 months ago, but I think about it so often that I'm turning it into a video. So, it's been said that the fairy type in Pokemon is poorly designed. This is usually a sentiment echoed in competitive spaces, and while I can totally understand why competitive players feel this way, I've always felt this statement was kind of harsh. I mean, the justification for Fairy's creation is that it was made to balance the type chart, and especially Dragon, but after months of sarcastically asking myself how Game Freak would have balanced these types without Fairy, I eventually began to ask that question seriously. This started when I noticed that all the types that interact with Fairy already have connections to each other. Poison resists fighting, Steel resists Dragon, and Bug is super effective against Dark, which means Game Freak probably could have just doubled down on these interactions instead of adding a middleman. Thematically, it makes enough sense that Poison could weaken a fighter's body, while a Steel Sword could pierce the Dragon's skin, therefore making Poison and Steel super effective against fighting a Dragon. And while the relationship between Bug and Dark is a bit harder to justify since the latter is technically evil type in Japan, most people online seem to agree that this interaction exists because of bug-themed superheroes in Japan, and specifically Kamen Rider. I don't know enough about Japanese culture to know if that association is actually accurate, but since it comes up so much online, I'm just willing to believe it, I guess. And since Dark's other heroic weaknesses are also resistant to it, I don't think it'd be a huge stretch to let Bug resist it too. Of course, I'd still neutralize Steel's resistance to Dark and Ghost in exchange for letting it take down one of the strongest types in the game, now Dragon instead of Fairy. However, in addition to trading Dark's neutrality against Steel for an ineffectiveness against Bug, I'd also like to make Ghost weak to Psychic in exchange for its neutrality against Steel. This might be overkill since I'm aware that Psychic terrain is really popular right now, but since I've also heard people complain about Ghost being too strong, I wanted to throw in my 2 cents on the matter. Thematically, it just made sense to me since psychics are often portrayed as being able to exorcise, or at least detect ghosts, like in Mob Psycho 100 and Dandadan. However, balance-wise, it also gives regular psychic Pokemon more to do because, despite the sizable population of powerful psychic-type legendaries, the type as a whole doesn't have a well-defined niche. Most of the things it excels at are arguably done better by other types, so adding to its strengths while mitigating its poor matchup against Ghost would probably help it stand out more. That being said, the abundance of strong psychic Pokemon is still important for the purpose of checking Ghosts, since you can really only balance strong Pokemon with other strong Pokemon, but I'll get into that later. First, I need to address whether or not this Fairyless type chart would even be balanced to begin with. I think Fighting and Steel would more or less be balanced the way that they are in the actual games, but the changes to the other types are underwhelming, to say the least. In Poison's case, its super effectiveness against fighting would arguably be less valuable than its actual strength over Fairy, since the latter is a much more relevant defensive type. Bug certainly benefits from gaining an extra resistance, but otherwise its coverage is still so subpar that most Pokemon would still have to rely on fighting moves to beat Dark types. And while Dragon does gain a new weakness, its broad neutral coverage still makes it nearly unstoppable on the offensive side since I didn't add any new resistances against it. So although it is possible to balance the type chart without Fairy, it would still be very flawed, at least with the approach I used. That's not to say Fairy's current implementation is perfect either. In fact, I actually agree with the critics that Fairy is somewhat overtuned, and that Poison and Steel don't do an ideal job of keeping them in check. However, I feel like some of the ideas that people throw around to fix these issues end up being just as shallow as the decisions they accuse Game Freak of making. For example, a lot of people think it was stupid to make Fairy resist Bug, which I agree with, but in the same breath, they'll suggest that Bug should have been super effective against Fairy all along, despite being just as bad as Poison and Steel offensively. And it's like, on the one hand, yes, it would be a good buff to the Bug type, but for Fairy, is it really an adequate nerf to make it weak to yet another type with terrible neutral coverage? I feel like a similar conversation happens around Ice and Dragon, where people question why Game Freak didn't just make Ice resist Dragon instead of creating Fairy. But again, even though this change would be great for Ice types, I don't think it would meaningfully impact the prevalence of Dragons, since it's not like this buff alone would transform Ice into a reliable defensive typing. Now, I'm not nitpicking these suggestions just to gatekeep Bug and Ice from getting better. Hell, I'm not even a game designer, so I don't know why I'm taking these proposals so seriously. But I think I really just wanted to highlight the shortcomings of these arguments because they're so common that they honestly kind of irk me. They're band-aid solutions at best, and at worst it's just an excuse for people to complain about Game Freak's balancing decisions, even though their proposals aren't much better. And I'm not saying you have to agree with those decisions, I just wish people would express their criticisms in a more respectful way, rather than treating Game Freak like a group of inexperienced morons who couldn't make a good game to save their lives. In any case, my point is that I already know Fairy isn't perfect, but neither are the criticisms levied against it. And with that in mind, it's finally time for me to explain how I would balance the Fairy type if it were up to me. Firstly, I would transfer Fairy's super effectiveness against fighting to poison, then I'd reverse its resistance to bug so that bug resists Fairy instead, and that's it. It sounds so minor when I say it out loud, but altogether, I really do feel like these changes would do a lot to dampen Fairy's power just by shuffling its strengths elsewhere. To put it into perspective, the real Fairy type has the exact same number of type interactions as water, whereas this revised Fairy type is more similar to electric, which is still good, just not as good. But to be more specific, this whole setup creates the secondary Dark and Dragon counters that the Fairy list type chart was missing, while also giving more substantial buffs to Poison and Bug than the actual type chart. The changes to Bug in particular are especially impactful since they get in the way of Fairy and Ground's perfect coverage while also making the plethora of Psychic Fairy types weak to Bug once again. And overall, I feel like these subtle changes strike the right balance between Fairy's intended design as the anti-meta type, while keeping its power relatively in check. However, this entire conversation about whether or not Fairy is well designed kind of leads me to ask, why is this so important in the first place? I mean, obviously it's because people want the game to be balanced, but a lot of people frame their issue with Fairy as Game Freak replacing one overpowered type with another overpowered type, and that means, by their own admission, that Dragon was also overpowered, right? So why is it okay for Dragon to dominate the metagame, but suddenly it's a problem when Fairy does it? I'm not gonna act like this line of thinking is inherently hypocritical. For example, if Fairy was super effective against Dragon, along with literally everything else, that would obviously be unbalanced and poorly designed, but if you believe that some other type deserved to be strong against Dragon instead, it would still have to be something that's already powerful anyway, because like I said earlier, you kind of need strong Pokemon to balance other strong Pokemon. Otherwise, people will complain that it's not enough. That's why I have to disagree with people who suggest that Fairy was a result of unprecedented carelessness on the part of Game Freak. I don't think they were being lazy or incompetent, I think they just knew that underwhelming updates to the type chart would be disappointing for everyone, so they decided to go overboard instead. That way, even if some people were mad, there would still be a demographic of players who were happy with the changes. Honestly, I'm a lot more excited to cover the Bug type because I just agree that it's a weak type, which means I don't have to waste as much time arguing about whether or not it deserves to get buffed. I will rant a bit on how it should be buffed, but I'll get into that in a second. First, I need to address Bug's main two problems. The most obvious one is that it's resisted by too many things, and the second and less obvious one is that it's largely outclassed in the few things it does excel at. Offensively, this is just because Bug has really bad neutral coverage, so it's generally the last type you'd choose to deal with Dark Psychic and especially Grass, but defensively, the problem is more that its resistances overlap entirely with the Flying type, and Flying is way better at utilizing those resistances. Resistance to Grass, Fighting, and Ground is great on paper, but when Flying can also deal super effective damage against the first two, is immune to the third, and is even super effective and resistant to Bug itself, it becomes an almost comical representation of Flying's superiority over Bug. So how would I fix this? Well, for problem 1, it's really just a matter of improving its neutral coverage by removing some of its not very effective hits. Fire and Flying are already super effective against Bug, so I don't think neutralizing them would accomplish much. Fighting type's resistance to Bug doesn't make much sense, but since the interaction is mutual and it doesn't have many resistances anyway, I wouldn't want to remove it either. Taking away Poison's resistance wouldn't be good since it doesn't have many merits besides its defensive profile, and since it makes enough sense that Bugs can't chew or claw their way through metal, I'm willing to let Steel keep its resistance as well, which leaves Ghost and Fairy as the types I would let Bug hit neutrally. In both cases, Ghost and Fairy are already strong enough without the Bug resistance, but additionally there just doesn't seem to be a strong thematic reason for either of them to have it in the first place. In fact, it's worth noting that Fairy's resistance to Bug has been heavily scrutinized to the point that many think it should have been weak to Bug instead, which I mentioned earlier, and while I'm not inherently opposed to the idea, I do take issue with the way people try to justify this proposal because often their rationale is that bugs eat fairies in fairy tales. And I'm like, firstly, which fairy tales? Like, I used to ask this sarcastically, but now I'm genuinely asking if there's a real story where this plot point happens. I'm just like a huge idiot or something. But secondly, even if there are stories where this happens, this logic only works under a very narrow definition of fairy that Pokemon doesn't really adhere to. Like, if you're picturing a winged humanoid like Tinkerbell getting devoured by a giant spider, that makes sense in isolation, but it's clear that Pokemon's definition of fairy is a lot more broad than that, since the type is also applied to other magical creatures like mermaids, witches, and trolls. In fact, very few fairy types actually fit the mold of a Tinkerbell-like fairy, and the closest one I can think of, Ribombee, isn't even that humanoid. Again, I don't want to shit on this idea completely because, like, obviously I can see the vision. Hell, I even made Bug resistant to fairy in the previous part, and in any case, it's not like Bug's other interactions are perfectly logical either. I just think that the bugs eat fairies in fairy tales justification is so weak and so frequently regurgitated in the discussions I've seen about the bug type that it drives me crazy. Personally, I think the most logical interaction between bug and fairy is that they should just be neutral to each other, since fairy often represents nature, and bugs are just a part of nature. But if I had to come up with a justification for why bugs should be good against fairy, I would just argue that bugs are very resilient in the face of everything that nature throws at them. Not that, like, there's these fairy tales that no one can ever actually name, but they're super common, I guess. I don't know. I don't know where people are getting that from. I wish when people said that, they would, like, specify which actual fairy tales, because if it's really common, you should be able to name them. But anyway, scaling down the list of bug-resistant types from 7 to 5 does a lot to mitigate Bug's subpar offenses. It's still comfortably below average, sitting somewhere between Poison and Steel, but not getting walled by 2 of the best types in the game anymore is a huge improvement. You could argue that I should have taken it further since I'm trying to buff Bug anyway, but I think it makes thematic sense that Bug type wouldn't be much of an offensive powerhouse. And in any case, I'd rather focus that energy into improving Bug's defenses since that's way less of an uphill battle. I already explained earlier why Bug could resist either Dark or Fairy, but there's also the possibility that it could just resist both. Regardless, giving Bug something to distinguish it from flying is the main objective, and all solutions make that happen. It's also just useful to resist common moves like Crunch, Dark Pulse, Moonblast, and Play Rough, especially in doubles since most Grass-type users of Rage Powder aren't resistant to Dark or Fairy. So, with its improved resistances and marginally better neutral coverage, I think these changes help Bug to establish a much more defensive identity compared to its current state, which doesn't really have a niche. However, since Game Freak doesn't seem keen on changing the type chart anytime soon, I'd like to go over 6 other suggestions to balance the Bug type that are probably more realistic. Number 1, raise their stats. I'm fine with Bugs having a lower base stat total compared to other types, but some could definitely use a boost. This would have to be handled on a case-by-case basis, but at the same time I feel like Game Freak has been doing a pretty good job of giving newer Bugs better stats, so I'm not overly concerned about this point. 2, while Bug has a lot of good status moves, I think Game Freak could get a lot more creative with the secondary effects of their damaging moves. Currently, the most common effect they have is inflicting some kind of stat reduction, which may or may not be useful depending on if the opponent even uses that stat, but the main strength of Bug moves is that nothing is immune to them, so I think Bug should really lean into the fact that they can debuff their opponents so reliably. My suggestion would be a Bug-type Dire Claw with only like a 30% chance to inflict status instead of 50% chance. And although it would be distributed to more than one Pokemon, the move's concept would be so tied to Bug anatomy that no other type could reasonably learn it. That's my top pick, but if a Bug-type Throat Chop or Psychic Noise is the best they can do, that's fine too, I guess. 3, because there are no mid-tier special moves for Bugs to use between Struggle Bug and Bug Buzz, I think Game Freak should add Silver, Wind, and Signal Beam back into the game. This is small compared to everything else and is more of an in-game problem than a competitive one, but I still felt it was worth mentioning. 4, I would lower U-Turn's accuracy to 90% to decrease its reliability. This might seem like a weird and oddly specific proposal, especially since I'm nerfing a Bug move this time, but for context, there are actually quite a few people who think U-Turn would be overpowered if Bug received any offensive buffs at all, and so they're just like, don't buff it. I can certainly see where these people are coming from, since it is a common move in competitive, but at the same time I think this fear is kind of overblown and comes from a misunderstanding of what makes U-Turn so strong in the first place. I mean, like, first of all, it seems kind of ridiculous to gatekeep the improvement of an entire type just because of one move, especially when there are so many other overpowered moves of other types. But second of all, the 3 offensive switching moves are only so powerful because they can deal damage while also bringing in a better party member, essentially accomplishing 2 tasks at once. That makes them extremely efficient and versatile. However, while certain types and abilities can render Volt Switch and Flip Turn completely useless, nothing of the sort really exists to prevent U-Turn from functioning, and I think that reliability is ultimately what makes it such a strong move. Having more types resist Bug might mitigate the overall damage dealt by U-Turn, but giving it a chance to fail altogether does a lot more to cut to the core of the problem, at least in my opinion. It's kind of similar to other utility moves like Struggle Bug, Snarl, and Icy Wind, where it's just like, it's really important that they have a chance to miss so that you aren't constantly getting your stats lowered. 5, I would nerf Stealth Rock, and also limit its distribution. I know heavy-duty boots exist, among other things, but a lot of bugs in other rock-weak Pokemon are essentially barred from using any other item because of Stealth Rock's 50% health cut. So for a conservative suggestion, I would just cap Stealth Rock's damage at 25% regardless of whether the Pokemon is 2 times weak or 4 times weak to it. I know Stealth Rock is a very controversial move, so people have a lot more creative ways to nerf it, but reducing its damage seemed like the simplest way to approach the problem. 6. Introduce a field condition or passive ability for the bug type. I don't have any particular suggestions for this, but I did watch this Moxie Boosted video where he proposed either a redirection immunity, permanent sticky hold, or permanent keen eye. I've also seen some people propose a confusion immunity, but I think the best of all the suggestions I've read is a flinch immunity, since it's extremely common both in-game and in competitive. Personally, I think it'd be a little funnier if bugs just had a higher chance to cause flinching since they're scary, but that could easily become overpowered, so I'm not actually suggesting that. In any case, a passive ability or field condition for bugs would be very helpful because those attributes can't be neutralized, unlike bugs' resistance to grass, ground, and fighting. Of all the types that are considered bad, Ice is probably the one that's easiest to explain why. Basically, it has a disproportionate number of weaknesses compared to its singular resistance, and that makes Ice-type Pokemon extremely hard to use, despite Ice-type moves having great coverage. It doesn't help that Water types often learn Ice-type moves and end up using them better due to their superior defenses, but thankfully it's pretty easy to fix this problem just by giving Ice like 2 to 3 more resistances. I mean, Game Freak could also just make more Ice types into glass cannons, but I want to boost the viability of existing bulky Ice types as well, especially since many of them already have the stats, moves, and abilities they need to succeed anyway. So for my first suggestion, I'd like to put forward Water. This might seem like an odd pick since I could have just chosen a type that Ice is already super effective against, but since a lot of people think Water should have been weak to Ice to begin with, it just felt like the most intuitive option. Of course, like I said earlier, Ice's biggest flaw is its defenses, so actually making Water weak to Ice wouldn't accomplish much on its own. However, in conjunction with Freeze Dry, this new resistance actually becomes really useful. It certainly helps that Water Pokemon are extremely common, but it's even more helpful that many of them try to cover their weaknesses with Ice moves, because that means Ice Pokemon would be able to wall one of the most common offensive type combinations in the whole game. It's honestly kind of perfect, which is why I'm somewhat less excited to announce Ground as my second suggestion. It's not like Ground is a bad type to resist, it's just that most Ground Pokemon come with Rock coverage, which obviously isn't great for Ice types. On the other hand, since Earthquake is so ubiquitous even amongst non-Ground types, this actually gives Ice a lot of opportunities to switch in, so I guess it evens out. It's certainly used more often than most Dragon moves since they're basically never used as coverage, and while Flying moves are pretty good offensively, it's so evenly balanced that the cost to the Flying type and the benefit to the Ice type is hardly worth it. This is even more so the case for Grass, which is resisted by so many types already that I have to question why people bring it up as a possible Ice resistance at all. Like, leave Grass alone! I understand that you're trying to buff Ice, but it shows a complete lack of consideration for the type on the receiving end of this change, whereas Water and Ground are at least powerful enough to withstand a nerf like this. But with that in mind, that finally leads me to my last proposal for an Ice resistance, which is the Electric type. Thematically, I chose Electric because Ice is a poor conductor, at least I think so. I didn't major in physics, but similar to my other suggestions, it also takes advantage of Ice's resistance to itself, this time resulting in a unique resistance to Bolt Beam coverage. It's a good niche to have, though compared to Water and Ground, I'm not as confident about this buff since it would put Electric roughly on par with Poison, offensively. Then again, since Water and Flying are so common both in-game and in competitive, it's probably not like the worst trade-off, so maybe it's fine. I'm not sure. And so, those would be my main suggestions for the ice type. Though, in the interest of transparency, I should mention that I didn't come up with these ideas myself. All of them were actually introduced to me in this video by Cami Meal Tea, and although my reasoning wasn't always the same, I did ultimately reach the same conclusions. The only major difference is that I didn't remove the ice type's weakness to rock, in part because its above average offenses are basically rock's only redeeming quality, but also because I felt like these additional resistances would compensate for ice's poor defensive qualities adequately enough. Not that it'd be perfect, of course, just that it'd be enough to provide ice with more switch-in opportunities and reduce spread damage in doubles. So, what was even the point of this video? Was it really just another vehicle to prop up my own opinion by complaining about random fandom discourse? Yes. I mean, even for the first section, I was only inspired to make it because of this tangent from a Wolfie VGC video, where he called Fairy a better version of Psychic. To be clear, I'm not questioning Wolfie's expertise as a literal VGC champion, nor am I disagreeing with his broader point that Fairy is better than Psychic overall. I just felt it was a weird comparison to draw in the first place when their respective metagame dominance arose from completely different traits and circumstances. It wasn't even like the main crux of that video, and yet it prompted me to low-key obsess over Fairy the same way Moxie got me to think about the bug type. It's a mindset I felt prone to ever since starting my channel, but lately I've been wanting to make something less reactionary, for lack of a better word. Like, I don't even think my channel is that negative, but because I often make my videos in response to a larger online discussion, I feel like I tend to put myself in a defensive position, and that can be really draining. Even for a topic as unserious as the Pokemon type chart, I get kind of exhausted seeing the same arguments repeat over and over again, which is why I want to make something that hopefully won't prompt the same response for my next video. You know, something along the lines of a Gator X or Ample Samuel video where it's basically an appreciation post. They're still capable of critical analysis, but the conversation is largely focused on what they enjoyed rather than what they didn't. And while I know this is kind of like a weird note to leave the video on, I didn't initially plan on putting these three topics together, so there really isn't much of a thesis beyond here's how I'd balance this type. Aside from lowering its accuracy, I think you could also nerf U-turn either by cutting its PP or cutting its base power. Reducing its PP would mostly just force the player to use U-turn more sparingly, whereas nerfing its base power would mitigate its chip damage to the point that it wouldn't even matter under certain circumstances. For a specific number, I think it'd be reasonable to cut it down to like 60 base power, but if you're worried about technician-boosted U-turns from Scizor, then maybe 50 would be better. As for limiting U-turn's distribution primarily to bug Pokemon, which is another suggestion I've seen, while it's not a bad idea, it's not a great one either, at least on its own. On the one hand, it would reduce the number of viable U-turn users since most of them would be weak to Stealth Rock, but on the other hand, because U-turn is such a versatile move, it would probably still show up a lot in competitive singles anyway, just in the hands of the few non-bug Pokemon that still have it. This nerf could totally still work, but I think it'd really only be worth it if it happened in conjunction with one of the other changes I mentioned earlier. That being said, while I do think reducing U-turn's distribution could work from a balance perspective, I don't know if it'd be as easy to justify from a thematic perspective. Similar to Knockoff, the premise of the move is just so broad that it could theoretically be applied to any Pokemon's moveset. I mean, it's literally just a hit and run, hence its Japanese name Round Trip, and while it can also be translated as Dragonfly Return, nothing in the move's description or animation suggests that Dragonfly physiology is required to execute the move. At most, it seems like this pun just inspired U-turn's typing similar to Aerial Ace. That move is called Swallow Return in Japanese, and it's not because wings and talons are needed to perform it, it's just a reference to a sword technique that mimics the motion of a swallow's tail feathers in flight. That's why so many non-flying type Pokemon learn this flying type move. I assume Game Freak had a similar thought process when making Girafarig a psychic type, but my point is, in contrast to moves like Toxic and Scald, U-turn doesn't necessarily indicate what kinds of Pokemon it should be limited to, other than vehicular ones that are already powerful.